Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much, Sarah, for your speech and for describing what appears to be very likely Scotland's position in this United Kingdom. I'd like to introduce our next panellist, Professor Baird. He will expose the structural indicators of colonialism, in Scotland's case underdevelopment, cultural marginalisation and democratic manipulation, again otherwise known as the BBC. And he will draw parallels with other formerly colonised nations. He will demonstrate that Scotland exhibits the essential features of dependency. So may I introduce you to Alf Baird.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, David. I'd like to also thank SSRG for, again, another wonderful event, similar to the one we had in 2022, which was a launch pad, as Sarah said, of many new developments, and also to Liberation Scotland and Salvo members and supporters, committees and so on, who do some amazing work behind the scenes, and the result of which we see pretty much what is here today. So going back to what Sarah said about the wretched of the earth, I've borrowed Fanon's great work to lead off in this brief presentation. And Frantz Fanon, we have to remember, was instrumental also in helping develop the United Nations self-determination process, decolonization events thereafter. So it's very important that we understand also and take from post-colonial theory where we can. I just want to quickly refer to, hopefully you see some of this anyway, Fanon's 3 phases of decolonization, which I'm grateful, as I was very much, to the late Ian Lawson for publicising much of my work and research, and doing that research, a little piece of article as well about Fanon's 3 phases of decolonization, which demonstrated that the first phase, as we can see here, is the rise of the dominant national party, which is played along pretty much by the imperial power in many respects, and it suffers mainly from the usual colonial procedures, manipulation, divide and rule, and the confidential agents pensioned off at high reward are also part of that process, as Phil mentioned this morning. That we see then that dominant national party, the people who have put their faith in to liberate them, takes them up successive blind alleys and ends up behaving in a different way, in a different manner. That leads to the rupture in the movement, which we've seen in the last several years, and as Fanon said, the development of new national parties, new initiatives, and also organisations such as Salvo, Liberation, and also SSRG as a think tank. So we see that happening. We then see better understanding of the people, and the people in Scotland are developing that better understanding as we go. It's not been an easy process. Not many people really knew what independence meant in 2014. Not many people knew that it was decolonisation. And that is the method and process most countries, practically all countries, have achieved independence since the self-determination process was developed and before. So we are in that process. We're now, I would say, into Fanon's 3rd phase, people understanding the true path to liberation and understanding that there is only one remedy for the colonial condition, and that is liberation of the people, liberation and sovereignty being reclaimed. And going back to what Sarah was mentioning about the treaty, of course, every colonised people were handed a worthless treaty, and we were no different. So that's where we are. Some people believe that treaty was worth something, but in reality it's found out to be what is regarded in post-colonial theory as another colonial hoax. So we then as we move towards self-determination, the process itself, we see that there is criteria for a non-self-governing territory, NSGT, and the main criteria there is the territory is geographically separate from the administrative power. Second factor, which I found very important in my research, particularly in the book Dún Hodden, was the importance of culture and language, indigenous culture and language, building national consciousness. And this Fanon maintained in his book and books that it was a fundamental aspect of independence, liberation, national consciousness. Without that, there is no momentum really for independence. And that's built on national culture and indigenous languages particularly. And that's where in the UN's aspects here, conditions, the linguistic and cultural aspects of a people, basically the ethnicity, is extremely important, although we don't talk about it too much in the Scottish context, or we're accused of certain things. The third aspect is territory lacks a sufficient measure of self-government. So looking then at briefly at the structural indicators of colonialism, what I am looking at is things like economic underdevelopment, cultural marginalization, demographic manipulation, the essential features of a dependency, which also was covered this morning and intimated in Phil's speech about how the territory here is becoming even more dependent on England for its energy, even though we produce endless amounts of energy. But I'll focus particularly on elements of trade in that sense, which is my background. And then the psychological aspect, because we have to remember that colonialism, although it's about economic exploitation, political control, cultural domination, it's based on psychology. It's no mistake, really, that people like Fanon and other post-colonial theorists were very big psychologists. So, economic underdevelopment, we have massive trade interception, which it means that basically about 2/3 of Scottish trade is dominated by one country, that's England. Most of our exports, raw materials exports and other goods are exported at low costs, particularly oil and gas, energy, other aspects, aggregates. And imports come in through England's supply chain, Scotland is dominated by England's supply chain, so pretty much everything coming here is supplied by one country, England. Therefore we have limited emphasis by the administrative power, which is also the colonial power, on providing direct links. So aviation, seaports are downplayed. This was always historically the case with the idea of Prestwick as a global aviation hub, which it should be. And in independent Scotland, it would be, not just for freight, but I think also for intercontinental aviation, passenger travel. Scotland could easily be the Keflavik of Western Europe. And many of us as we travel via Iceland know that it's a mid-Atlantic load centre. And Scotland is about 1 hour aviation time shorter to most European capitals on transatlantic routes. So it has a strategic position. Shipping as well, and I've worked on hub and spoke networks and around the world, and two of the projects here which could have developed were major seaports at Hunterston and Scapa Flow for intercontinental container transshipment. These were all blocked by the Westminster government. So Scotland is not developed in that sense, and there's a good quote there by the Earl of Glasgow in 1946, almost a century ago now, implicitly that Scotland is to have no contact with the outside world except through London. And this was throughout English Westminster policy papers on any different policy area, transport, economics, industry. Scotland was to have no contact with the outside world. And this goes to even today, where Westminster tells the Scottish ministers they can't deal with anything international, which is where we are. So limited economic infrastructure and adequate public services, and we have a zero growth position and a very poor GDP position, historically high levels of unemployment, poverty, deprivation, inequality, high energy costs, a narrow industrial concentration. So basically what we are is set up to serve the mother country, and that's a colonial structural weakness for our economy particularly. So we end up with a very uncompetitive economy. If we look quickly at GDP, we can see there Scotland's GDP measure $40,000 per capita compared to Norway, Ireland over 100,000. So we are less than half the best, if you like. Something seriously wrong here. because Scotland has enormous resources, a small population, a big landmass, a fairly big landmass, and 60-odd% of the exclusive economic zone, as Phil also mentioned this morning. I don't know if he's still here, but he gave us great info today. But there we go. So Scots have a colonial GDP in that sense. It's artificially low. The thing about colonialism is its aim, its purpose is to widen inequality. This is where I can't quite get my head around the Scottish government and Holyrood and Victoria Keys saying their priority is to reduce inequality or to eradicate poverty. They can never do this under colonial regime because the colonizer will always intercept the value, the wealth, the trade that we have. So my estimate here is that Scotland's GDP should normally be between $60,000, $70,000 per capita or more. If it was that minimum, if it was that level, which is just about Danish level, we're looking for £100 billion. We're looking probably for £150 billion. And this is the cost of colonialism. One way or another, this is extracted from Scotland through a hoax treaty. And that is the cost of colonialism. So it's a monstrous amount of money, and you can just imagine, 150 billion is 3 times the block grant. So Holyrood are scrapping around for 40 billion, adding to it little bits of taxation they can do to fix our potholes and fix our hospitals and do things with the schools and whatnot. But they could have more than double that under independence, easily, with probably a lot of spare change. So it's an enormous amount of money, but it's a colonial balance sheet we have. If we look at energy, this was also mentioned in significantly this morning. So we see that our energy price is the highest in the world. Yet we have enormous energy surpluses. And we should have cables directly across the sea. We should be selling that energy not just to our neighbour England, who dominates it and takes it for nothing with no royalties coming back. We should be selling it to the continent, for sure. And we would be a very wealthy trading economy with that. So we have a massive opportunity cost here, zero economic growth, a very poor GDP, underdevelopment. And this means that the colonial economy in society is unable to develop. This is why our economy looks more like, and some parts of our cities look more like Murmansk Oblast than mid-Norway, if you like. But so it's a terrible difference in capability. So colonized people are always left impoverished in that sense. If we look at cultural marginalization, going back to Fanon leans very heavily on culture, and as do other post-colonial theorists such as Memmi and Saussure. Independence is a fight for a national culture. And we're subject to a form of cultural imperialism which imposes an alien culture on Scotland. And this enculturation leads in turn to that psychological condition we know of the Scottish cultural cringe, which is a form of self-hatred, and also related to the theory of internalized racism or appropriated racial oppression, which people suffer from. So it's quite a serious, debilitating disorder. And the only remedy for that condition is liberation. So we have to be aware of that. That condition will continue if we do not secure our freedom in that sense. We have what's called the illusion of culture, and half the world were deluded into thinking they were British. Many still are. Scots were no exception. But at the end of the day, that's the contest between. That was the contest between the yes/no vote in 2014. Was basically your identity. Did you feel more British or more Scottish? And that was the post-referendum research results of Edinburgh University. That's what it came down to. It came down to identity as a cultural emotion. And this goes back to Fanon's conclusion that the desire for nationhood is a cultural emotion, which is very, very important. Not so big an issue about economics, about pensions, about whatever. It's a cultural emotion that what comes out, and then the psychological conditioning comes into that and influences people's mindsets. Now, part of that is language suppression and linguistic imperialism. We had it with the Gaelic language. We have it with the Scots language. These languages were not taught. Now that's being remedied in the case of Gaelic, but the British state and its administration here are going very, very slow on the Scots language, even although the Council of Europe and other agencies have informed the Scottish Government and British Government that people have a right to their language. Linguistic rights are very important, and that's a fundamental part of the definition of a non-self-governing territory as well. So we're on that track. We have demographic manipulation. We've had it for centuries. We had it with the clearances, the forced evictions, the genocide, the 1700s and 1800s, then the mass imperial resettlement programs and imperial resettlement acts, indentured labour, all sorts of mechanisms to clear Scotland. And in post-colonial theory, that's simply called banishment of the natives. Banishment of the natives. However it's dressed up, that's what it is. It's removing the indigenous people, as many as possible. And what happens then is a replacement with a meritocracy. A meritocracy which in our case mainly historically has come from south of the border, England, even into Victorian times and before that. So most of the top jobs, as we know, were always advertised in London press. So where do you think your meritocracy is coming from? And the doors of opportunity are only opened by one language. That's the coloniser's language. So the more Scots you speak, the less likely you're going to get opportunities. So out-migration, emigration, was the only solution for many Scots seeking escape from poverty, unemployment, and lack of opportunity due to colonial mismanagement. So the essential features of a dependency, colonialism, we have to remember, is force. It's otherwise known as geographic violence. So you're held tight. So any opportunities to liberate the people or to assert self-determination is blocked, especially by the colonisers' courts, of course. So Scotland is governed from outside, its national identity is suppressed, resources are exploited, its democratic will is subordinated, and so on. So we have all these elements of dependency, markers of dependency. We also have the misrepresentation that the United Kingdom has portrayed Scotland as a willing partner in a democratic union and not as an annexed territory with a worthless treaty. So the reality is quite clear, because we can see it in the economic reality, the cultural reality, educational, everything else is a colonial reality. So that narrative has to be then challenged, and that's what's being done. The narrative is being challenged through the United Nations and other agencies. Just want to briefly touch on the psychological aspects, because this is very important. Colonialism is based on psychology. Césaire, I should mention, was Fanon's teacher in Martinique. So this goes back even before Fanon. But the reality still remains the same. Colonialism is a disease of the mind. Colonized people develop a schizoid element, and that's Dr. Purvis's findings and his view about the Scots language suppression. When Scots bairns go into schools and are taught to learn another language and to discard their own mother tongue, which is a key issue. It's always a colonial procedure, wherever it is, India, Kenya, Malaysia, Ireland, Scotland. We all suffered the same thing of colonial bilingualism, or what they called the torture of colonial bilingualism, where you have to suppress your own mother tongue and speak another folk's language if you want to get on in life. So there we are. This is the problem with the colonial mindset, of course, is colonialism is always a cooperative venture with native elites. Native elites buy into it. They assimilate. They become like the colonizer. The Scotsman in the elite, the gentry, became English, as in Wales, as in Ireland. And that's the reality. So colonialism is always a joint venture with native elites. Doesn't matter whether it's here or in an African tribe or wherever. It's the same thing. And that's how it happens. So they place themselves in the service of the elites, and they adopt the ideology and values of the elites. And the ideology and values is very important, particularly the values. So the colonizers' values remain sovereign in the colony. And here we see the removal of our traditional values of the common good and the benefits to the wider society, the public domain, public goods, and we see privatization, private profit, private ownership, the private individual. So a totally different cultural and traditional philosophy And this is also go back to what Sarah said, is enshrined in the claim of right. All these aspects of Scottish cultural values and traditions are enshrined in our ancient constitution, but taken out the system when you're annexed and administered by another regime and culture. So we need to decolonize the mind as well as the nation. Just a quick look at Freud's theory, because it's very helpful if you want to see what happens here. We all know unionists, or what I would call colonialists, you cannot change their mind. Their mindset is fixed. It doesn't matter if you say Scotland's could be the wealthiest country in the world. They will say, nah. or they say, we're better where we are. And it's because what they do is, with the colonial mindset, people very similar to people develop defense mechanisms, what Freud defined as defense mechanisms, which include denial, distortion, suppression. They will block the trauma of past crimes against the people as well, such as genocide or banishment of the natives, exploitation, so on. A lot of this is in the book, which many of you have been forced to buy by my wife Linda at the door. I do apologise for that. But it takes a woman to do it. What can I say? Briefly, there's some of the mechanisms and the aspects of oppression are there: external political control, imperialism, linguistic and cultural, the imposition of a cultural hegemony that reflects a different culture, dominant culture, an underdeveloped people and economy, people, economic exploitation, prejudice, social linguistic, and so on. So that's the reality. And just to conclude, what matters here is the lived reality of Scottish people, and as we see in the evidence we have increasingly and gaining all the time, is that is structural subordination. We're not really asking for special treatment, we're just asking for our rights. We're claiming our right. We claim it, right. Yeah. So, and that's about that recognition reality of what has been existing in the last 300 years and what exists today, and why there's still a growing demand for independence and an understanding that independence means decolonization. So we're in that aspect now. The United Nations has the mechanism to reflect these injustices and to deal with them, and that's what we're appealing to in that sense. So we must no longer be the wretched of the earth. We have to reclaim our sovereignty, our rights, and our future. Thank you.